And I will end my slideshow, Dean, so that you can start sharing your screen. Probably didn't need to record that bit. But while Dean is pulling up his slides, I just wanted to say, please feel free to use the chat feature to ask questions as we go. And if there's anything that pops up that I should interject into the conversation, we will make it interactive like that. Wrong screen, Dean. We're seeing an email there as opposed to the presentation. So FYI. There you go. That did the trick. And so we are recording. Steve asked if I'm transcribing. I'll take notes as well, but I wasn't planning to transcribe. So, all right, Dean, take it away.
All right, thank you, Amanda. When you said you were going to have some great speakers today, I think Matt and I were looking around trying to figure out who you were talking about. So that's where things start. Good afternoon, everyone. As Amanda said, myself and Matt are going to be hopefully somewhat entertaining you over the next half an hour, 45 minutes, giving you a counterpart to the conversation that took place about a month or so ago on the contractual side of business decisions. I did not actually attend the full conversation on that, so if there's some overlap, I will apologize in advance for that. A couple other things, caveats. Number one, as Amanda referenced, I've been in solar O&M for about 8.5 years now. So a lot of what I'm going to talk about today is based on the probably 1,001 mistakes I've made over that 8.5-year period. So this is certainly lessons learned the wrong way. So if you hear something that sounds stupid, that's probably because I did something that was stupid. So no worries there. Second of all, I have a lot of background on utility scale O&M and a fair amount in C&I scale O&M. I've never really dipped my toe into the residential side of the market. We got close with some military installations out in California, but I never actually was able to pull the trigger on that. So if you have a residential solar O&M story that you want to share as I'm going through this, please feel free to jump in, because a lot of what I'm going to say may not be super applicable to the residential space. And finally, there's a member of my family that always says all the opinions that I offer are either misguided, uneducated, or just plain wrong. So if anyone during this call feels that same way about what I'm saying, you are in good colleagues, good cohorts with my 16-year-old daughter. So feel free to think that to yourself. Finally, my background just a little bit. I was with First Solar for about half a decade out in Tempe, handling the utility scale side of things. And then I was with Borrego up in Massachusetts about 3 years. And now I'm with Energy Support Services, an affiliate of New Energy Equity down here in Annapolis. So a little bit, 8.5 years of O&M experience. The fellow a little bit talking after me, Matt Herman, who lives in a much better place than I do. He's out in Golden, Colorado. He's quite experienced with Namaste Solar out there. And he's also quite a do-it-yourself home project builder. So if you want experience on drywall in your kitchen or countertops or any of that, he's definitely a man to go to. So we've got this divided into two sort of different areas. One is business decisions that I'm going to focus on, talk about the customers that we're all so happy to have in our lives, scope of work, and then I'm going to get a little bit in the guarantees, whether it's a response guarantee or performance guarantee or an availability guarantee. And then Matt will jump in with some more explicit discussions around contract terms, constructive consideration, as well as full wraps. So that's where we're going to try to sort of steer the conversations. Talking with Amanda and Matt this morning, we will not be insulted if you want to jump in over us and ask a question immediately. We also won't be insulted if you want to hold your conversation or comments to the end. We are hopefully going to make it enjoyable for you all, and it shouldn't be, hopefully there'll be some free-flowing information. So first of all, I'm going to talk about the customers and assessing the customers. And obviously they're needed in this part of the equation. Someone needs to pay our bills. However, I always hate when I go into a job interview and the first question the person asks me is, hey, Mr. Anderson, I'm looking at your resume. Is the customer always right from your perspective? Never really a good answer or bad answer. You know what the answer is supposed to be, but in any event, I'm just going to give you couple of perspectives on the customers that I've entertained over the years. We had a customer in California. The plant was big enough that we had an actual plant manager who would need to go to the site every day, and he would oversee their technicians. The owner had an ownership rep that sat on the site, would come in, Monday through Friday, 8 o'clock in the morning, 5 o'clock, to oversee basically the work we were doing. This individual, and it was a flow down from the management team, was so painstakingly difficult to deal with. Our plant manager would be driving in his truck in the morning before he could even get to his parking spot, before he could even put his car in park, before he could even get a cup of coffee. This individual was pounding on the window of his car, demanding why wasn't something being done about his system. What's going on? How are you going to fix it? That's one end of the extreme. The other end of the extreme, we would have customers that if there was some sort of issue at their site, for instance, a high heat event, and the fire department was there, or there were inspectors there, you'd pick up the phone and notify this individual immediately, and he would say, Dean or Joe, whoever the person was contacting him, I trust your team. You guys got it handled. Deal with the situation now, and then call me back afterwards once you have the details in place. One end of the spectrum to the other. My point here is you've got customers that are all over the place with regards to what they want, what they think they need, what they want to get out of you, the details, what's their level of sophistication. One other comparison. We had a customer who constantly had his own asset managers look over the VAS platform. Their whole point, even though they were paying us to monitor their systems, was to be able to call us on the phone and say, hey, you've got a communication error alert that popped 15 seconds ago. Why aren't you guys taking care of that? One end of the spectrum. The other end of the spectrum is we had a customer who the way he would do his truck rolls is he'd wait to the end of the month, get a bill from the utility and see how his comparison for that month was to last year at the same time. If it was off by more than 10%, then he would pick up the phone and call his fellow to go out there and roll the truck. Opposite ends of the spectrum, sophistication and needs of the customers are obviously all over the place. However, moving to the more important side of the equation, which is our side of the equation, the vendors. What are we expecting, or what would we like to get out of this relationship that we have with the various customers? Is it straight revenue? I mean, are we just doing this obviously to increase how much money we're getting in the door? That's certainly part of it. Are we trying to grow a partnership? Are we thinking if we get in with this one company that'll meet more and more business with them or other of their peers down the road? Do we have a geographic region where we already have a certain number of techs and we need to really increase their workload because right now they're underutilized? Is that why we're jumping into a new contract with some of these other companies? Is it for bragging rights? Is it the end of the year when you say, yes, I have 500 megawatts or 500 kilowatts or whatever it is on the various industry rag? Yes, we've moved their way up there. Why are we trying to get a relationship going with a new customer? Is it plain old pride? Meaning, am I better? Am I going to be happier if I have more contracts than Borrego? Am I going to be happier, in comparison between Solve and First Solar? Who's got the most O&M contracts? Where do we sit in the whole pecking order? Why are we doing that? Final thing is, what sort of company are you? Are you someone who just does third-party O&M deals, or do you also develop projects? Do you also manufacture the modules? Depending on what your overall company strategy is and which sort of areas of industry you're in, different reasons for getting in with a customer. Obviously, if you can sell O&M to a customer that also is going to be potentially looking to do development deals with you, that's completely different than if you're just doing O&M type of service. So not only are you assessing what the customer's needs are, what their sophistication is, you also need to figure out why you're going into it. New versus repeat customer scenarios. It's absolutely easier if you go through it the first time. I'm thinking of a big customer we had out in actually they used to be based in Boulder. And after you go through the first time, you get a beautiful master service agreement in place. It's going to handle all their portfolios, the projects they give to you. You come to trust them, they come to trust you. It's one of those scenarios. If you pick up the phone and call them and say, yeah, go ahead and do what's right. You're treating the project like it's your own. Much easier to deal with than if it's a brand new customer every time. I would would say it's similar, as my wife always says, the first time you build a piece of furniture from me, Dean, it takes you 10 hours. The second time it takes you 1 hour. Same sort of thing. After I've got the first master service agreement in place, the second time through is about 90% easier. So new customers, repeat customers, obviously the repeat customers are the ones you want to hang on to, the ones you keep going after, the ones that make your lives easier. Okay, leveling the playing field between system owners and vendors. Interesting question. How can you sort of jettison your crappy customers? If there's someone that really is, for whatever reason, not someone you want to continue to do business with, how do you get rid of them? Or from a contractual standpoint, how do you sort of limit your exposure to them? Obviously, you can limit the term of the contract. Obviously, you can put in termination for convenience clauses. Obviously, for instance, if you're going to do a portfolio projects with these guys and they promise you 10 and they've only delivered 5, you put some language in that allows you to negotiate the pricing for the rest of the contracts. Other thing to think about when you are trying to jettison a crappy customer, what are the other downsides? Does it mean this is a customer that if you don't go along with this one project, they'll no longer give you more seats at the table for a future RFP? I've gotten burned by that in the past with a group in New Jersey. They kicked us off on one of their deals and all the future RFPs, and they had like 3 or 4 a year, they'd exclude us from that. That's certainly something that we need to keep in mind. If you lose a customer, are you still going to be able to meet your internal metrics for the year or for the quarter or for the longer term? Are you going to get support from your management team if you're losing customers that aren't necessarily, from their vantage points, ones that you should be letting go? Finally, point with customers, and I've been burned in this a huge amount, is the individual you negotiate a contract with is almost always different than the individual that's going to be managing the contract when it's done. And sometimes it really works to your benefit, meaning you've just gotten through 6 months of yelling at each other back and forth across the table, getting a contract in place. And the next day, this individual walks in who's going to be managing the project with you, and he or she is just a fresh of breath air. It's like, oh yeah, the contract is what it is. We're going to figure out a way to work together. I'm going to make your life easier. You're going to make my life easier. It's always sort of, you got to figure out who's going to be the other side of the table, not only when you are negotiating the contract, but also when you are actually implementing the contract. I can't tell you how many different personalities I've encountered over the years, with people that are actually on the other end once the system comes up and operating. Is it some young kid who basically wants you to teach him his or her job, teach everything about solar? You're on the phone with them, you can hear them Googling things in the background, and they ask you a question, and then they Google some more, and they ask you another question. Some people do almost use it as a graduate school, so that's good. Are you involved with a customer who literally, his boss's boss yelled at his boss then yelled at him, so he figures everything rolls downhill, so now he's going to get on the phone and yell at you? And is that someone you want to have as a customer? Is it someone who's just trying to pick your brains until they decide to take it in-house? So again, depending on who the system owner eventually is going to be, something to keep in mind right when you start the negotiations, if it's a new customer, what the final outcome is going to be. So I'm going to stop there. I guarantee people have better stories than I do about customers, both good and bad. So if anyone wants to offer one up, feel free to.
When you enter into a negotiation, Dean, do you ask that question? Like, so, Bob, you and I will be negotiating this contract, but who will actually be administering it in the end? And does that change anything for you in the way that you approach it? Because I'm sort of intrigued by that point about how sometimes it's nice to have a fresh face across the table when it comes to the actual administration, because contract negotiations often kind of feel ugly, right? Like people are kind of hammering on each other. And
yeah, I would say that's the top 5 questions that I ask. Is, it's great to meet you. How would you flight in? Where are you having dinner? When are you leaving? But it's also, hey, are you going to be the one that's going to be handling this contract once we go forward? Because I'm sure you're really busy with your own job, but the operational side of the student is going to be handled by someone else. And they usually will say, well, yeah, that's going to be a different team. Oh, yeah, I know a lot of people in the industry. Who could that be? Oh, it's Julie so and so. Oh, yeah, I know her. So you kind of get a lay of the land immediately who's the other end of the line going to be. And if it's a bigger customer or other customer, you already know who the individual is.
Have you ever encountered a situation where in those early conversations, enough red flags were tripped that you were like, I don't want this customer. Like it's going to be so much more painful to have this customer in our portfolio than it would be for me to lose them. Like, and what were the flags and how did you get out of it if so?
Sure. There are definitely flags. If I pick up the phone and someone says, "Hey, Dean, this is so and so. I've heard such great things about your company. I can't wait to work for you and work with you. And I've got, 21 projects in New Jersey, and I'm willing to bring them over to you in the next 30 days because I'm firing my current vendor. They're terrible. I can't do anything right. I'm getting rid of them, and you guys are you're going to save the day." Like, wait a minute. First of all, I've never talked to you before. I'm not sure how you're going to realize that I'm going to save you the day. And second of all, if you and your old vendor are parting ways on 30-day notice, it probably means something pretty bad happened. So that is certainly, I would say, if the over sales part from the customer is too nauseating, then I'm going to back out. The other thing is, yes, there have been certainly times when I'll get, and it's usually with some of the investment bankers that are on the other end of the line that are trying to get things set up. And when they start drilling down, it's usually not at first, it's usually the second or third day, when they start drilling down into some of the expectations they have for you, usually around reporting, usually around monitoring, usually around a lot of things. You can say, from a cost perspective, what I originally gave you in my proposal isn't lining up with what you're telling me the scope of work is going to be right now. So I have certainly pulled out of that as well. It's nice to be in kind of a role of leadership where you can do that, is when you're a young guy, a young person starting off. It's difficult to tell your boss, I want to turn down a $25,000 deal because I think these guys will be a bunch of pain in the butts to work with.
Yeah, that's a good segue into scope of work.
Yep. All right. So another great topic of O&M. You got to, regardless of who's on the other end of the table, other end of the phone, you got to make sure that what you think you're selling them is what they think they're getting. I mean, regardless if you call it your all encompassing comprehensive package or gold package or platinum package, it's one thing versus the basic package or silver package or bronze package, which is basically just your PM once a year, a little bit of monitoring, a little bit of reporting, maybe some warranty management. One of the things I really dislike is when we get to the end of the contract and we say to the other side, I can't tell, are the truck rolls included in this or not? Are all the spare parts included in this or not? I mean, that needs to be meeting the minds, as my picture shows here. Early on, you got to know what sort of scope you're signing up for. Are you signing up with a customer who wants the whole thing and they really want nothing more than once a month to see a report? Are you signing up with a customer that wants the phone to ring every single time you see an alert or alarm? It's definitely something you need to keep in mind. What you're offering is what the customer is expecting to see. Brings me to my second point. Overselling and under-delivering. I have worked both the operation side, execution side of the world, as well as the sales side of the world. And nothing pisses the operation side off more than these sales folks that I've been one of them that goes out there and just promises the world, absolutely we can do that for you. No question we'll be out there 365 days a year, 2 hours after your alarm goes off to shovel your walk. No problem at all. It is just, again, it's a fine line because you want to bring in new revenue, you want to bring in new customers, but you also don't want to just piss your operation team off where everyone quits and says, I can go work for someone else who's not overselling this. Absolutely needs to be a fine line. Story, true story. We had one salesperson once who was trying to, pitch our project, pitch our services, and was going on and on about how we were going to take care of the transformers on site. And I kept saying to this person, you probably don't want to say that too much. No, we really want to talk to the transformers. Turns out, and I knew it, but unfortunately this individual didn't, that this owner didn't have any transformers. They were in an area of the country they need transformers. So we're trying to sell them something that they obviously did not need at all. Another individual, trying to sell on the DaaS platforms that are monitoring capability. Customer didn't want us to do the monitoring. They wanted to do the monitoring themselves. So you got to know what the customer wants. You got to, please don't oversell. It's just going to make the whole industry look bad. I also have had worked for a lot of people that at the end use the exhibit B or exhibit C at the end of the owner agreement. You're going to say, I'm going to make a huge spreadsheet that's going to have 1,005 tasks, and we're going to put a check mark next to it. Either it's included or it's not included. And if it's not in there, it doesn't count. That only works to a certain extent. I mean, you obviously need to know some of the big items, which included, which not, but to have these monstrous checklists with regards to what you think needs to be in and needs to be out. There's always nitpicking. Well, you said that pest maintenance was included. Does pest include the crows that come down and they're chewing on the wires? Is that considered pest, or is that considered a force majeure, or is that considered something we should have anticipated in advance? So tread carefully when you're trying to put these huge tasks at the end of your contracts. One thing I will note is a lot of people do a great job putting in what their scope is for the electrical side of things, not so much on the ancillary side of things. Whether that's vegetation management, pest control, if it's a bigger site, who handles the utilities for the plant, it's the little office building that's on site. You need to make sure you have that lined up with regards to who's on the hook for what. True story, New Mexico. The facility that we were operating and maintaining was fairly near to a high school. Every Friday night, the local high school kids, and this is not just New Mexico high school kids, it's all the high school kids across the world, would go out and build big bonfires on the edge of the property. It was part of the solar deal, but it was outside of the arrays. So every Monday morning we come in and we find the beer cans, the broken pieces of the furniture, the trash everywhere. And the owner just expected that since that was on the property, that every Monday morning our guys would go out there with these big shovels, these big trash cans, and clean all the crap up. And it happened about 56 times a year. And so we're like, guys, this really isn't part of a solar maintenance oversight to pick up the teenagers' crap. This, party they have every Friday. No, you guys can do that. You can do that. You can do that. End of the year, we figured out it cost us about $17,000 to pick up this teenagers' crap over a period of a year. So again, I keep track of what's in and what's out of scope. When you are talking for additional,
so you should write that as an exclusion, like we do not cover for party detritus should the event or should the
unless you're invited to it, then you can cover it. But no, typically not, right?
You'll have to do your after hours maintenance on a Friday night.
Yeah.
To discourage them from chucking stuff in.
Yeah, it was. New Mexico is a great place to do business. Just side note, we had some people that came in and stole a bunch of modules from one of their sites, and the next day they had it up on eBay. Hey, we have 20 modules. So of course we called them up and we went over there with the police and we picked up these idiots that were selling stolen modules. It was just criminality not aside. So additional fee services, we definitely, I think Matt's going to touch on more of this later, but with regards to if you do have additional fee services, whether it's picking up the trash teenager or whether it's, a fence that got knocked down during a snowstorm, we have certainly found what works. If the threshold around like it's $500 or less, we can go ahead and roll a truck and get that put in place. If it's more than $500 or $1,000 or whatever it is, it's something that the owner has to sign off on. That's worked pretty well over the years. Another problem we've encountered though is sometimes the companies that we're working with, they started off small, so their CEO or their CFOs to sign all the authority letters. So you need to find out ahead of time, hey, is this going to be something that's going to be real difficult for the owners to sign off on with regards to additional fee services? And then just finally, spare parts.
Actually, real quick question on that additional fee services and getting approval. Do you find that, is there a good way to document those items that you end up getting a verbal approval for? Do you try to make it a best practice that if you get a phone call and they verbally ask you to do something, you subsequently send an email saying, just to summarize our conversation, here's what I heard approval for up to X dollars? Or how do you handle verbal approvals?
So that's a softball. We'll hit it on the park for you, Amanda. Yes, we've often, again, 1,001 mistakes, it's typically not something that's nefarious on the part of the owner. It's just, they're rushed. They're like, yeah, we really need to get you out there and get the equipment back online as quickly as possible. Or we need you to order something, go ahead and throw it in the credit card. And it's usually, again, it's not someone trying to pull something. It's a younger person normally. And then when you finally get the invoice put together and you send it over to them 2 months later, his or her manager or boss or supervisor says, wait a minute, why do we agree to $8,500 for these fuses? And I don't see anything written about it at all. And you'll say, well, it's because I talked to Joe and Joe said to go ahead and authorize. And they're like, well, I'm looking at Joe right now and Joe looks very red in the face, but he's claiming that he never authorized it, guys. So it's like, well, okay, we need to make sure that either we have an email in writing or, with all the software nowadays, it's pretty easy to fly back and forth. So yes, Amanda, we definitely, again, if it's something that is, if it's a cost that we know we're not going to be able to eat, we wouldn't want to eat, then we need to get something for it. And then just to finish off, spare parts. Again, I'm not sure Matt will touch on this or not, but spare parts versus consumables versus replacement parts, always something that sort of needs to be kept in mind. Hey, if there's a spare parts placed on the site, are we going to be the ones accounting for the spare parts in there, or are you? Who's going to insure it? Who's actually paying for the Connex box? If it's a Connex box, does it require a permit depending on what state you're in? When spare parts get delivered, are our guys going to be there to receive it, or are your guys going to be there to receive it? What's the security of spare parts around? If we use a spare part that was originally came over to us from the EPC, are we expected to replenish that at our cost, or is that something we're going to be able to bill you for? Once we leave the site, if we start off with 10 breakers, the 10 breakers still need to be in the spare parts inventory, or will they be gone? So spare parts, again, just something that you need to have a meeting of the minds on early on.
Yeah, it seems like we could talk about that for an hour.
All right, I'm going to move on to my last slide before I turn it over to Mr. Matt. And it's got to do with guarantees. So guarantees mean a lot of things to a lot of people. When I think guarantees, I think of, like if I have an annuity. All right, Mr. Anderson, you're going to get either 5% or the higher of the market at the time. So I know my floor is 5%. I know I'm going to get a 5% return on my money. There's the guarantee of, we guarantee to accept all credit applications at your local sales car store. Right? Guarantees not much anything. You have the guarantee of my 16-year-old daughter who says she guarantees she'll be home at midnight on Friday night. A lot of guarantees aren't worth a whole lot of anything. So the three guarantees that I've sort of encountered over the years have been availability guarantees, performance guarantees, and response guarantees. And again, a lot of different meanings to a lot of different people. So just you think response guarantee is fairly straightforward. However, it's not. Is the response time? Meaning, does the clock start when I get the alert? Is it when I get the alert and I've notified the owner? Does it start when I get the alert, I've notified the owner, and the owner allows me to go to the site? Is it the time from the alert first came in to the time I'm actually on the site? Is it from when the alert first came in to the time that I'm on the site and I've actually identified the problem? Is it from when I actually get to the site to when the problem is resolved? So when you hear a response time guarantee from anyone, you got to ask 2 or 3 follow-up questions. Exactly what is the response time guarantee? My view is, and this is just my opinion, which is probably wrong, the response time should be, if you have a contract where the owner says they have to approve you to roll a truck, it should be between the time they approve you to roll a truck and you're on site. So for instance, at ESS, if we have a same-day response time guarantee, our owner tells us at noon, yes, you're free to go, we need to be on the site by the end of the business day. Other type of response time, and that's for us to get to the site. I do not like hearing response to mitigate, because by the time you get out there and you start looking at what's the problem is, there's a high likelihood that you either don't have the part with you or you need to rely on someone else to come and fix it. So response time guarantees, I actually like that. I've seen those a lot more recently, particularly in the Northeast, where you have some customers, and we actually lost some customers who said, we need same day response time guarantees from you all. And so if you can't get there within the same day, or like if it's afternoon one day, get there the next morning, we're not going to use the vendor. So I think I would say in general, and particularly in the C&I space, response time guarantees are probably becoming more and more common. But it's certainly something that I'd be comfortable with as long as you have the manpower to get out there. Availability guarantees. Obviously, you're really looking at how much time the equipment is either up or down. So that's certainly something that you have in your control. Back at First Solar, that was back in early 2011. We offered a lot of those availability guarantees. At the time, it was fairly low level, 96, 97% availability guarantees. As people got more and more sophisticated, that availability level kept up higher and higher. Certainly back in 2011, 2012, we had a lot of guarantees, availability guarantees that allowed us for upside, meaning that if we overperformed the 98% threshold, there was some money coming back to us. Those have also either crept up to 99 or 99.5, or they've gone away altogether, where the owners just want the downside. They don't want to have to pay you if you're really knocking it out of the park. Availability guarantees over the years have gotten much, much, much more complex. I used to work on availability guarantee language until it basically drove me insane, because you would go on for 14, 15, 16 pages of these availability guarantee, and just, everything from, well, if you have this section of the rate, it's getting this type of a radiance, if this section of the rate is getting this type of radiance, and you compare them to their peer inverters, at what point in time do you start seeing D rates? So it can get incredibly sophisticated, depending on who your customer is. It is, I'm not entirely sure it's worth it, but a lot of time spent putting availability guarantees in place. Availability guarantees are the first thing that I got comfortable with, and then it moved to performance guarantees. Performance guarantees basically, obviously, meaning what's the over generation of the solar. You can take a look at it from a perspective of the equipment being up and down. You also have to put in, what was the financial model's expectations around irradiance, whether it's PMY3 data or real-time data, whatever it is. Performance guarantees are certainly something that a lot of the banks like to see. So I would say, just as far as the trend goes, availability guarantees with upside and downside, moving to performance guarantees with predominantly downside, and then getting into more recently, I've seen a lot of response time guarantees, particularly in the C&I space.
I have a question about guarantees. Did you ever arrive at language that you think is fair and reasonable within that, along with a good list of what's excluded from those guarantees? Because it seems to me that anytime you're talking about guarantees, exclusions are really important to protect yourself from taking on risk of things that are outside of your control.
Yeah, so one of my favorite quotes from one of the guys one of the customers they had at Borrego was, he said, solar guarantees are BS. They're worthless. There's so many carve outs there, meaningless. Why even bother? Why would I pay extra for an availability guarantee if you have carve outs for 20 things that can potentially happen? So I think for a lot of folks, yes, Amanda, I have a pretty extensive list if you want to throw in the availability guarantee that you could possibly think of. It depends a lot, again, on the owner. What's their reason for having an availability guarantee? Is it just something so to keep their banks happy to say, okay, I've got a fleet of 350 projects, and yes, I have an availability guarantee on all of them? Versus, is it just one or two landowners who have smaller projects and they really want to make sure that their investment is protected? So the question is, did I ever arrive at language? I arrived at language that I liked. Usually took up about 3 pages. Again, if you particularly more sophisticated customers, they can easily range for 10, 12 pages at a time, which, like I said, drove me insane.
That's crazy. And I feel like understanding what the customer is really after feels like the key part there. Are they just trying to check a box to satisfy their bank? Or are they really going to be like breathing down your neck about this anytime, something is off for an hour? And I think that those exclusions lists are there to protect us, right? Because if they're trying to pin a bunch of stuff on us that we are not in control over, that's a problem. you know, and yet I do also have an appreciation for where they're coming from, that they're trying to make sure they're doing their job and keeping a fire lit under you. Although a lot of it just seems like risk shedding from their shoulders to ours.
Yeah, and the other thing is, so what's the level of what's the level that you're willing to give them on a guarantee? And I, again, just my own experience, it's usually about 100% of 1 year's annual fees. So that's not including what you'd be paying someone to cut the grass. It's not including ancillary fees. It's if you're all in cost is 10, if you're all in annual fee, you're charging them is 10 grand. Nowadays, I'd say it's fairly standard for them to ask for at least 1 full year's worth of annual fees, which is not a great business model, but I'd say that's fairly standard, unfortunately. I have seen it more recently for some of the bigger projects to go up to 150 or 200% of it. Obviously, some things to keep in mind is if you have multiple systems, can you put the availability guarantee across all the systems? So if one system underperforms, but the other one's overperformed, can you level it out that way? Can you do it over a period of years? So when you do the true up on the availability or the performance guarantee, you're looking at it over a period of 5 years. If you do really crappy the first 2 years, you have room to make it up in years 3, 4, and 5. So there are certainly some ways to mitigate that. It's certainly something you need to figure out how comfortable you are offering a guarantee. That's based on obviously the financial profile, how many folks you have in the field, what kind of equipment you have. And I should also take a step back. If someone comes to you and says, like my New Jersey example, they said, you're the greatest thing in the world, get rid of our old vendor, we're going to bring you on. And by the way, I want an availability guarantee. Bye. Hang up the phone. Like, wait a minute, what do you think I just signed up for? Do not, if it's a system that's been up and running for 5 or 6 years, and they come to you and they say, I want a performance guarantee, or I want an availability guarantee, your first response should be, let's take a look at the data. Let me see the reports that the previous vendor generated. Let me look at also energy, see what's coming out of there. Let me look at your corrective maintenance records. And by the way, we'll start off with the basic package where we'll do our PM once a year, we'll do the monitoring, see how many truck rolls we are on your dime, and then at year 2 or 3, if you want to switch to comprehensive, we can talk about it at that time. Some of the big RFPs that came out in 2018 and 19, and probably all know what I'm talking about, they were looking for major guarantees, but when you asked to look in the data room to figure out what the actual performance of the sites had been up to then, there wasn't any data in there, so they were just expecting to take that risk. So yeah, something to be very cognizant of. So I'm running way into Matt's time, Matt, I apologize, but just one last thing. This is the question Matt has asked before. Hey, do these availability, performance, or response time guarantees ever truly get enforced? I can say I've probably been involved with 15 to 20 of them over the years. The bigger projects, sometimes the bigger owners want to make a point by making you send them a check at the end of the year. They are netted out against your Q1 invoice. Other than that, I would say in the C&I space, it typically gets into the point where they're going to use it as a negotiation. Okay, I'm not going to make you pay me the $3,000 that you owed me for X, but I'm going to, you need to give me 4 or 5 free truck rolls the next year. Or on the other side, if the C&I provider is really hitting out of the park, rather than charge the customer more for that, we'll say, well, for the next portfolio RFP you go out with, make sure I'm included in that. So do they ever really get enforced? Somewhat on the bigger size projects, the C&I world, I would say rarely. It's usually a talking point as far as negotiations or something else. I think it also depends on what kind of company you are. If you're a company that also built the project, that's more of a likelihood the company's going to go back to you and say, okay, well, you guys screwed me on the EPC there, so you're going to have to pay me something on the owning side of it. But if you're a third-party vendor, again, just my experience has been, it doesn't get enforced that often. So
that's been my suspicion all along.
Good.
All right.
Mr. Home Builder, I will turn it over to you.
Thanks, Dean. And Matt, sorry that our time management has been lacking, but I know you can talk fast.
No worries at all. Appreciate the shout out to the home building. I was giving Amanda and Dean a tour of our recently installed kitchen counters. We might not actually have to wash our dishes in our sink shortly here. So it's very exciting news over here in the Herman household. Just to kick things off, I think some of the things I wanted to focus on in this conversation were really just some of the minute details that I didn't know would be problems when I first started in this position and started kind of heading up negotiations and such. And primarily things that create heartburn for downstream stakeholders. To Dean's point, the overpromising and under-delivering on the sales side, well, those chickens come to roost sometimes and end up with unhappy operations folks. But I did want to say, just a plug as one of the board members here, value. The Amicus O&M Co-op has some pretty fantastic contracts that address a lot of these issues that I was speaking to here, and we actually use that kind of as a base for our contract overhaul. After I got some good feedback from one of our customers, kind of eviscerating our legacy contract, which was great, and it's a great starting point if you're trying to update your language. Again, you can find those on Podio here very easily. Anywho, so first couple things I wanted to talk through are just some of the explicit contract details. A lot of this kind of overlaps with things Dean was talking about, but just again, things that have created heartache for us over time. And we all likely have legacy agreements that have different terms and probably have half a dozen to a dozen different ways we are apparently billing for things via those contracts. But two things that I wanted to touch on here are just travel costs. We've found over time being very explicit with how you deal with truck rolls, for example, is pretty important. Looking back at some of our previous contracts, it's not clear exactly when we bill for drive time or when we don't, or if you're billing for one-way travel or you're billing for miles or hours, and more importantly, how does that actually translate to your CRM or your work order ticketing system? And I think what we've tried to do is really curate those sort of rates around travel based on what's easiest to convey to our operations folks and track that way. So evaluating that to understand, like, hey, can layperson understand what the hell I'm talking about here, as far as when I bill for travel and how you're going to go about doing that. We're actually shifting towards trying to just explicitly say, hey, this is what our per site visit travel cost is. So 3 hours away, so we're going to bill you for 2 hours of windshield time every time. Put that in our CRM. You don't have to worry about technicians tracking their time or your, whoever's dispatching, understanding the mileage away, things like that. Just have a fixed number. So when you're billing for that site, you can tag it on as your travel expense for those visits. Another piece, Dean hit on it a wee bit here too, but OEM warranty support, having really clear language about how much we're going to support you as a customer. Obviously we have, I'm sure folks have experience working with a number of lackluster manufacturers out there, and it can be a wee bit challenging at times to compensate your sort of dispatchers and folks that are working directly with customers for pretty extensive labor hours to process some of those. So having terms in your agreement, so in case you have a particularly drawn out RMA process, you can go back and bill for that. In addition to that, we've had customers that will push back when we send them a first bill for troubleshooting and starting RMA. Like, hey, well, you haven't gotten us the new unit back, so you're not going to send us a bill until that's installed. So to the point of Dean's meeting of the minds, being really clear with folks and understand what those expectations are, and potentially including that explicitly. It's rare that happens, but just one thing to touch on there.
Have you ever had a client challenge you about that, or not want to pay a bill for an extended RMA process? Did you find anything that particularly got through to them on that?
Yeah, well, I had an hour-long conversation with a customer out here for a bill that was outstanding for 2 years to get that paid. So that was a pretty significant expense on our end. That just that was an issue with more of our AR side of not following up on that. But yeah, they just didn't understand why we were charging for that. Number one, like, hey, that's part of we shouldn't be on the hook for that sort of work, especially in the context when you're the EPC, right? That gets a little sticky when you're blending a workmanship warranty with equipment warranties and such. But yeah, we have had folks push back on that. So it's a wee bit tricky sometimes. So it's just takes some explanation. I think more sophisticated customers understand that that's the case. But folks, especially in that C&I space, that are like, well, yeah, you promised that this manufacturer was going to be fine, and now you're billing me for all this stuff. Yeah, that can get a little sticky. So just being really explicit that labor will be billed for in those circumstances. You know, the other thing that I found pretty early on was having explicit payment schedules is really important. We run into so many gosh darn issues with like round off error, for example, where we're charging $1 more per quarterly invoice across 40 sites, and suddenly we have to go change around our entire payment schedule over 20 invoice milestones per site. It's just a huge pain in the ass. So being really explicit, having something that you can again show the customer, hey, can we agree that this is what we're going to bill you for? Great. And it's in your agreement. You can reference it really quickly. Again, just save that headache on the back end. Attaching your invoice templates, hey, what do you require for your ERP to actually process these invoices? This is what we have. Is this going to be a problem? Do you have PO numbers we need to include? How do you issue those PO numbers? We have a customer that we do the work on site, we send them an invoice, they then send us a PO, we then have to edit our invoice, send it back with that new PO, and then we get paid. That's just, again, unnecessary headache. And I think some overlap with Dean of just get into those really fine details to understand how much suck you're going to create for downstream stakeholders and understand if you need to adjust pricing accordingly. Another thing that can be helpful, just digging through legacy contracts, being really explicit with contract dates. Is it actually 3 years for this term, or is it 3 years to the end of the 3rd calendar year, but your contract started in June? So how long are we actually obligated to either meet guarantees, or how long should we be billing for? And I've had a hell of a time digging through legacy contracts, sometimes understanding when those actually expire or otherwise. Yeah, generally though, things to save your operations folks and your AR folks some headache and time. Other thing I wanted to touch on is we've been getting into more complex scopes of work, specifically corrective scopes of work, as we all will be. We've done a lot of repowering of legacy stray inverters for CSU. We've gotten some quotes out there for replacing some central Snyder units. And, as we've been doing some of that work, it's really important that you have payment milestones. It's just a different animal from, your typical service work where you're just sending, an invoice for a couple hours of labor on site and maybe some parts. You have, tens of thousands of dollars sometimes that you're spending on equipment. And if you don't have a clear invoice milestone on, a quote or something like that, you're carrying that expense potentially for months on end. So, really, really clearly billing out, hey, here's a deposit for our design scope. Here's your, milestone for materials. Here's milestone for, say you're doing a de-install, for that part of the scope. And that might be apparent to some folks already, but that was definitely a lesson learned when we were waiting 3 months for equipment to come in, and we had our finance team nattering at us as to why we were carrying this large expense with no revenue to match. So that was a good learning experience there. Also, just for those sort of projects, just having some CYA language. Old 10, 15-year-old aluminum racking is going to gull, it's going to strip, it's going to do all sorts of things that you don't know until you start taking it apart. So having really clear language and expectations set early on that there's potential for change orders, things of that nature. And then, finer details. Who's responsible, for updating utility interconnection agreements, for example, for, changing out inverters and things of that nature. Really being really clear of, what you're responsible for as the vendor and what the customer is, so that when it comes time and they're asking, hey, you haven't updated the document with Excel Energy yet? And well, that's not our job here. The last thing is just, speaking to kind of the full wrap sort of an idea. In addition to guarantees, we've seen requests for these. We've engaged in one for a portfolio of about 50 sites. And really what we found the help being is just reducing invoicing issues. I think we all know that we spend a lot of administrative time sorting through, piddly $250 invoices. It's really nice to just have that included in a recurring invoice, on a quarterly basis, for example. But some really important things, and I can see I did not edit this correctly, but evaluating your historical dispatches if you're considering pricing, things like that. And then being really clear, like what is actually covered in a full wrap. Are there, is it everything? Is it just these very minor scopes for troubleshooting and consumables and things of that nature? And capping specific scopes. We're only going to replace 2 string inverters per year, or things of that nature. So you can kind of cover yourself if you start getting into larger scopes and things of that nature. So we found it to be pretty beneficial, but it was really important to make sure those finer details were hashed out. That is all I got, and we are at 2 o'clock, so apologies, I don't have a ton of time for questions at the end here, but thank you all for your time. And yeah, hopefully that would give some interest, decent context as far as some of the lessons learned on my end as well.
Any burning questions from the audience before we let y'all go? I know it is top of the hour, so my apologies for not staying more on top of that. All right. Well, I will take your silence as testament to the excellence of our presenters. I will be sharing the slides and the recording on Podio, so if you wanted to go back and check anything out or follow up with one of them, I'm sure Matt and Dean would be happy to take questions later.